What's up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. History. This lecture is Introduction to World War II, at least the European part of World War II, and it's part two. So if you hadn't watched the first chunk of lecture notes that I had done this week, I'd highly recommend you go back and start there and view that first. You definitely want to have your notepad out and jot down some of the highlights that I'll kind of emphasize as we go through it. And that'll come in handy for the quiz that'll be coming up in the near future. And like I've said numerous times, basically all of my exam questions come off of my lecture notes too. So in part one, I talked about the Nazis' rise to power. Now, Hitler was very angry about the way World War I was resolved, felt cheated. And then once he comes to power, he really locks down like all control of the media, starts doing a lot of rotten stuff and really like targeting the Jews and scapegoating them and blaming them for the way World War I finished, which was all kind of nonsense. But hey, it kind of stuck and he was able to use that to his advantage. All right, so what causes World War II? Well, there's a whole lot of different factors and issues and stuff that you could say were to blame for World War II. But if I was going to boil it down to one really concise thing, just a very simple, silver bullet type answer, I would say it's unresolved issues from World War I, what I have underlined up there. So you might want to put that in your notes. As I made it bold and underlined, kind of an important thing. And here's the other thing. World War I and World War II are totally linked together. I've heard some historians say that 100 years from now in the future, it's likely they're not going to call it World War I and World War II. They'll just say like the World Wars. And it's really almost like the same conflict that just had like a 20-year lull in the fighting where things stopped and then it just the coals never went out and the fire ignited again. Anyway, at this point in time, we still do call it World War I and World War II. They're looked at as separate conflicts, but in a lot of ways, they are. A lot of things change between the two wars, but they're definitely linked together. So because of what happened hold on, let me pause there and go back. If the Germans had won World War I, or if it had had a different outcome where it stayed a stalemate and neither side won, one thing you can be 100% certain of is that Adolf Hitler would have never become the political leader or the dictator of Germany because he was kind of a nobody. He was an average soldier out in the trenches. In Germany in World War I had been a monarchy. You had to be in the right family, in the Hohenzollern dynasty. Like they had a Kaiser who was essentially like a king or an emperor. So regular commoners didn't have much sway in Germany. And if that government had stayed intact, there's really no path to power for Hitler. But at the end of World War I, one of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was they were getting rid of the Kaiser and the German government, and they switched it to a democracy. So that's kind of important to remember, too. It's not like all democracies are always good and dictatorships are always bad. Hitler came to power only because Germany was a democracy. There was so much anger and animosity in Germany. That was how he was able to get elected and get people in the Nazi party, kind of his cronies, all elected into the Reichstag, which is like their Congress. And they actually came to power through legal means. And then once they had power, then they changed the whole system and it became kind of a dictatorship again. So why did World War II break out? Well, really, it all boils down to its unresolved issues and animosity and anger left over from World War I. So to get a little more specific in that, definitely write that part down. And then I would maybe do some lines and link in these next things. What specifically do I mean by unresolved issues from World War I? Because that could be a lot of different things. Well, for one, Germany had defeated Russia in World War I, right? Remember the Russian Revolution had happened. Their czar got hit, didn't get his head chopped off. He actually got shot and stabbed, but he was taken out and removed. So was his whole family. Russia had just quit the war. They were a hot mess, and Germany had won that front of the war. But Germany lost territory on both sides. All right, so if you look at this map where my cursor's at right now, that was what the map of Europe looked like right at the beginning of World War I. Okay, you see Germany, very big country right there in the center of Europe. Now, this map is made by a different company, so it looks not quite the best comparison, but you had the Austrian Empire down here, which is like totally gone. Now you have Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland is a new country on the map. Well, Germany had lost a little territory to France, and then they lost a lot of territory out in the east. Now, the way the war resolved, I think a lot of German people could wrap their head around why they lost some land to France. The Allies over here, the British, French, and Americans, had essentially defeated them. So that kind of made sense. But they felt like, hey, out here on the Eastern Front, Russia didn't even finish the war, and we beat them. Germany felt like we shouldn't have lost any land out in the East. And instead, the Allies came in and just kind of redrew the whole map of Europe. And this new country, Poland, is created. Or actually, it was an old country that was just kind of reintroduced and came back. It had been there a few hundred years ago, and now it's back on the map again. So Germany, actually, this part right here, East Prussia, where my cursor is, was part of Germany. And that was where a lot of the military leadership was from. But now you have this Polish corridor there that separates it from the rest of Germany. That didn't set well with the German people. They were kind of angry about that their country had been chopped up into two sections and that they had lost land out east. Another thing that ties into World War I, Germany didn't feel like they were the only country responsible for the war. And if you remember back to my World War I lectures, there was a lot of blame to go around. It was just a mess with all the alliances, and everybody felt they were the best. Everybody was building up militaries, and all it took was one little spark, one little war, kind of down in the Balkans, like down in this part where Yugoslavia is, and that ignited the whole alliance system. And next thing you know, the whole continent's at war. So I think they kind of had a point there. Germany definitely was partly to blame for World War I, but I don't think it was fair to say that they're the only country that should get blamed for it. So they feel kind of like they got screwed on that too. That's like a pride thing. And then last up, another really big issue that was left over from the war, Germany had to pay billions of dollars in reparations. That means money back to the Allies. And most of the money they paid went to France and Belgium because those were the two countries where the trenches had run through. So it kind of makes sense. Like they get money back from Germany to kind of clean up the countryside and go fill in the trenches and get rid of all, the no man's land and all that stuff. The problem was that the German economy was in ruins after World War I. They didn't have money to give. So it was kind of like kicking them while they were down. And that was always something the Germans had to, in those years in the early 1920s when they were down in the dumps and people were literally starving to death in Germany and unemployment was super high. They still were paying higher taxes to pay those reparations back. So there's a lot of anger and animosity there. And really it was leftover issues from World War I that ends up leading ultimately to World War II. Now, to give you some more details here of what Hitler actually did, like some specifics that are leading to the buildup of the outbreak of this conflict again, I would recommend you really write all of this stuff down, and I'd list it off just how I have it in order. So Hitler comes to power in 1934. That would be a good little date you could put in there too. That he first enters politics in the 1920s. He kind of has, mixed results there. But then when the German economy crashes after the stock market crash of 1929 that happened in America, well, that spreads out across America and then across the world. American banks call in their loans that they had given to Germany. And the German economy tanks again immediately, and it's even worse, a worse depression than it probably was here in America. Well, Hitler in 1930, right after that happens, now all of a sudden his message really rings with the German people again because he's whipping people up and making them mad and angry and saying, you got screwed by the Allies and the Jews, they stabbed us in the back. So now his message really starts to resonate again. By 1934, that's a good date for you to have. Hitler is firmly in power. One of the first things he does is he takes control of all the media, all of the newspapers, so that anything the German people are hearing at that point from 1934 on is all approved by Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who is a rotten kind of, weaselly type guy. But he was very good at his job, and he's spinning all this propaganda out there, which is the only thing that the German people had access to was approved by the Nazi party. So it becomes really easy for Hitler to manipulate the German people and make them only see what he wants them to see. And it gets them really angry and fired up. After Hitler takes control of all the media and news outlets, the next thing he does is he wants to restore the German Empire. He wants to rebuild the Reich. Reich is the German name for empire. And he ends up calling it, if you ever watched a World War II movie, the Third Reich. The first Reich, or the first German empire, would have been way back like in medieval times. It had kind of collapsed and fallen apart. The second German Reich would have been like the empire that was going on during World War I, and then that gets dismantled when Germany loses the First World War. And then he wants to rebuild a third German Reich, the Third Reich, okay? You can't do that unless you have an army. And after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles that America, France, Great Britain all kind of like forced onto Germany said they couldn't have a military. Basically, no Air Force. Their Navy had to be extremely limited, and they were only allowed a 100,000-man army. Now, if you remember back to World War I, at its peak, the Germans had by far the best ground army in the world. I think at its height, there was about like 7 or 8 million young German men that were in uniform. So a massive army that's really well trained. The Treaty of Versailles said Germany could only have a 100,000-man army. So just a small fraction. I mean, a lot of people said at the time it really wasn't an army at all. It was almost like a police force is all it is. You're not going to win against any of those other European powers if you only have 100,000 guys. So Hitler immediately ignores that when he comes into power, and he starts training more German soldiers. He starts recruiting more guys in. Now, did the British and French and the Americans, did we know that was going on? Yes, we did. It was hard to keep a secret like that as you start training like massive amounts of guys. Why didn't we do anything about it? Well, you got to think, what's going on in Britain, France, and America? We're in the Great Depression too. We're hurting. Think of like Cinderella Man and like the Jim Braddock story. This is going on like when Braddock's making his comeback and 25% of the American workforce is unemployed and people are starving to death in America. So, you know, nobody is really interested in going over there and picking another fight with Germany at this time because we're all worried about our own problems and our own economy and what's going on internally in our countries. So we know what's going on, but we just kind of ignore it. That emboldens Hitler. He starts building more and more and more. He starts building tanks. If you know anything about like German engineering or like the German auto companies today, like BMW and Mercedes-Benz, they were around back then too. And Germany is known for having great factories and really good engineers. So they designed some of the best tanks that had ever been around, way better than any of the tanks that were in World War I. Hitler also starts to beef up their Air Force. He realizes that, you know, planes have come a long way in the last 20 years since World War I, and now they're probably going to be a crucial part of any really good army out there. He also starts to build up the Navy again. Some big battleships, and Germany, just like in World War I, starts to reinvest in U-boats. So the German army gets really beefed up. And it's honestly probably, even during kind of the height of World War II, it's still probably not as good as the German army from World War I, but he does put together a pretty darn good fighting force again. Next thing, now he has an army ready to go, but the Germans still, you know, the German like leadership, the heads up in the military, they still don't feel like they're anywhere near ready to take on all the Allied powers again. They're pretty scared of that. They feel like, hey, we're getting stronger again, but let's not push our luck, because if America, France, Great Britain, Russia, if they all gang up on us again, we're screwed. We're going to be ruined. Hitler he really wants to push it though. So here you go. Look at the map I have. Follow my cursor. This is all of Germany, okay? Germany is right next to France and Belgium right there. This part of Germany on the French and Belgian border is called the Rhineland. It's on the Rhine River. So according to the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were not allowed to have any troops, any military equipment at all in the Rhineland. Why? Well, because that was where, if you're going to attack Belgium or France again, like they had done in World War I, you'd have to march through there. So they felt like we wanted a little buffer zone. So no German military equipment there, nothing like that. Policemen only, but no military equipment. Well, Hitler gives the order that we're going to march our army back into the Rhineland, and we are going to start defending our border again. And we're going to have the German army kind of protecting us because he said, well, what if the French or the Belgians want to come invade us, or the British? We need to police our borders again and be strong. But Hitler also at this point thinks he's not really ready for a fight, a big slugfest with the Allies. So he actually gives explicit orders He says when his German the commanders, the Panzer commanders, which are like the tank divisions, when they start going into the Rhineland, they are told specifically, very explicitly, that if you encounter any resistance, if even like one French soldier pops out on the road and says, halt, you can't go through here, this is illegal, they were supposed to turn around and go right back into the main part of Germany. All right. The British, French, everybody spies on everybody. They know this is kind of going on there. But again, the British and French in America is totally checked out because our economy's in the dumps and we're a whole ocean away. The British and French could have done something about that. They could have went in and said, no, we're enforcing the treaty. You can't have troops there. And that would have probably put Hitler in check, at least for a little while, but they did nothing. So then, Hitler feels emboldened again. He's like, all right, these guys, I'm starting to push them around. I'm starting to really gain some turf here again, even though he's not picking up land necessarily. But now he's able to put his military anywhere he wants in his country. And throughout this whole time, he keeps building his military up bigger and bigger and bigger. Next up, a big part of Hitler's master plan he called it the Anschluss. The Anschluss is a German word for essentially the concept is that all German-speaking people should all be unified in one country together. If you remember back to the part one of the lecture, I mentioned in there that Hitler actually was not a natural German citizen. He wasn't born in Germany. He was actually born in Austria, this country down here, which the Austrians also speak German. But for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, they've been two separate countries. Well, Hitler says, that's nonsense. Austria's backwards. They used to have an empire. It all fell apart after World War I. They're kind of backwards and incompetent, but they're our German-speaking cousins. I was Austrian too. It's time for us to all unify together. Well, Austria didn't really, most of the people there, they weren't too keen on the idea of Germany annexing them or taking them over. But Austria didn't have a great military. And it was there was actually a Nazi party down there. It was kind of the public opinion was kind of split on whether they wanted to join with Germany or not. Well, Hitler just decides he is going to march his army down there and take it. So with overwhelming force, he sends his planes all flying overhead. The tanks come in on the roads. The Austrians realize they could try to put up a fight and they could duke it out a little while, but they're really no match for the German army at this point. So they basically just let it happen. And Hitler is able to take all of his home country, Austria, and add it to Germany without firing a shot. They just fall. They just see what's happening, and they realize the only thing that's going to happen here if we fight the German army is a lot of our guys are going to die. So they just kind of let it happen. There's not much they could do about it. This really starts to embolden Hitler. Now, the British and French and the Americans are getting a little concerned. We see Germany really starting to expand and beef up its power over there. And we say, hey, you need to knock that off. But we don't do anything about it. And Hitler's like, yeah, I've heard that before. And he keeps getting more emboldened. He's getting more confidence. Now, the next part, kind of piggybacking off that Anschluss idea and what he did in Austria, Hitler makes the argument that, hey, on the border of Czechoslovakia, it's called this part in the pink here is called the Sudetenland. That is a part of Czechoslovakia, a new country that was created after World War I. But along that German border, there were a lot of German-speaking Czechoslovakian people in there that had been German or in Germany or Austria at one point, but now they're part of this new country, this Slavic country called Czechoslovakia. Hitler says, I have to get my German-speaking cousins. I need to add them to my country. It's not fair that they're over there in this Slavic country, which Hitler always regarded the Slavs as subhuman people. They were basically in his mind, maybe a notch above Jews, but they were pretty far down the totem pole. And he's like, I can't leave my German-speaking brothers and sisters down there, in a Slavic country. That wouldn't be right. Now, Czechoslovakia, this story is a little bit different from the Austrian one. The Czechs actually, this part of the country, the Sudetenland, is very mountainous. So they were ready to seal off all the mountain passes. And actually, even though Czechoslovakia is quite a bit smaller than Germany, they had a pretty solid, smaller army. They also had one of the best munitions munitions plants in all of Europe, the Skoda Works, where they made lots of really good artillery and guns. So they were ready to put up a fight, but they also knew that, hey, if all the German army comes in and attacks us, we aren't going to be able to beat them. They're a much bigger country and they have many more soldiers than us. But the Czechs were ready to fight, but they sent their ambassadors to Britain and France and said, hey, you guys need to have a backbone and you need to stand up to Hitler and tell him no, tell him to stop, enforce the Treaty of Versailles. The British and French kind of hem and haw over this, and they meet, and there's actually like the Munich Accords, which is a city in Germany where the American ambassador, who was at the time, it was President Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, and then British and French representatives all go there. They meet with Hitler. Hitler says, come on, guys, I just want the German-speaking part of the country. I'm not trying to like start a war or anything here. And he's actually able to sell it to him. In Britain, France, and America, going to war with Germany would have been unpopular at the time. But we definitely, hindsight, should have done something to try to put him in check. But instead, he's able to negotiate and talk his way out of it. And we basically sell the Czechs out. We say, okay, you can take the Sudetenland, just that part of Czechoslovakia, but don't take anything else after that. Well, Hitler, once that happens, the Czechs realize that they've been sold out. There's not much they can do. So once the British and French and Americans say, we're not going to stand up to Germany, they realize, well, we don't have a chance here, and they decide not to try to fight. So Hitler marches his tanks into the Sudetenland, takes that. Well, right after that, he says, what I really wanted was that big ammunition plant, which is over in the other part of Czechoslovakia. So he doesn't end up stopping at the Sudetenland, and he ends up marching right through and taking the rest of Czechoslovakia. Well, that kind of makes like the British, French, and Americans mad. We say, hey, you stop it. Don't take anything more. If you take anything more after this now, we're going to war with you. Well, what do you think Hitler's thinking? After breaking all of those things that I just mentioned, all of these stipulations in the Treaty of Versailles and having zero consequences, he's feeling like, yeah, right. You guys don't have a spine. You have no backbone. And why the heck would I stop here? It's time to rebuild the German Empire. I'm creating the Third Reich now. So next up, in a kind of bizarre twist, the Germans and the Russians had been arch enemies. Not only since World War I, but since way before that, actually. Russia, and I'm going to get into this more in a later lecture, but Russia is now a communist country. It's no longer Russia, it's the Soviet Union. And Germany is no longer really a democracy at this point. They are a name, like technically, but really it's become a dictatorship again, just under the authority of Hitler. They're a fascist country. So two terms that still get thrown around an awful lot today, but communism and fascism, we're going to come back to those, and I'm going to explain them a little bit better in the near future. Anyway, these two guys are arch enemies. The whole world is kind of expecting Hitler and Stalin, so Germany and the Soviet Union, to go to war with each other, and instead they end up having a secret meeting that the British and French and Americans are unaware of, and they make a pact with each other and say, hey, basically, we're going to be friends, and let's, as our first thing, a first kind of like good leaf thing, let's give each other a present, and we're both going to attack this smaller, weaker country, Poland, at the same time from separate directions, and we're going to divide the country in half. So poor Poland gets stuck in the middle of these two like monster armies that both invade it, and Poland tries to fight back, but their army is still like a World War I army. They're still flying with these like old bi-wing propeller planes. Half their soldiers have old bolt-action rifles, where the Germans and Russians, they're coming in with way more modern military equipment. So poor Poland doesn't stand a chance. But that happens, kind of a key date for you here, and I don't have it up here, but September 1st of 1939. That goes down as the beginning of World War II. That's the day Hitler invades Poland. Now, he was thinking, the Allies aren't going to do anything here. I've already broken this treaty so many times. Let's just see how far I can push it. The German generals, when Hitler does invade Poland and Great Britain and France declare war on him, they freak out. They're worried that, oh man, it's all going to go horribly wrong. And Hitler actually almost gets overthrown internally at this point. But he's able to take Poland pretty quick. And here's the thing that really helps him out. The British and French, they don't do anything. They declare war on them. They say, we're at war with you now, but they don't invade. They don't push it. They think that it's going to be like World War I again, that it's going to be a long, drawn-out conflict, that everybody's going to dig trenches, and it's going to go on for years and years. But the way technology had advanced to this point, that's not going to be the way that this war plays out. And it was a big mistake on their part to not go on the offensive and to just wait, start digging fortifications, and they're planning for a defensive war again. Anyway, I've gone on for a while here. We're going to wrap it up tomorrow with part 3 of the intro lecture. I'm going to tell you how the opening months of the war go. And then we're also going to have a follow-up quiz. So hang in there. See you tomorrow.